So we've talked about a whole lot of stuff. Finally, we get down to this thing called deeply inquiring into the teaching of Ehou, ichinyo, dharma, and robe. Kesa and dharma are one. So it used to be we had only 5 points of practice here, and they came very directly from many from Uchiyama Roshi and a few from Tosan. And this one was added sort of at my request. I asked the board to add this into the mission and these 6, because it became clear the more we really investigated this whole practice of sewing Buddha's robe, because it comes quite directly from Sawaki Roshi, and because Sawaki Roshi was really one of the prime movers and shakers of this thing in the 20th century, this is really important for our style of practice. This is really important for our Dharma family. So it's not that others are not sewing robes. A lot of people in North America and around the world are sewing robes. But we have this really interesting direct connection to it. So I really wanted to capture that and preserve it, because I think it also makes us responsible as a Dharma family for preserving Sawaki Roshi's teachings about these things and for making them available. Because we have Japanese folks in our Sangha, and we have access to people who can translate, and we have the Dogen Institute, and we have ways to create resources and make them available. It felt really important that we commit to doing that. So when you go to our website, you see this thing called the Sawaki Nyohoi Treasury, and that is the underpinning, right? That's the start. That's a place that's going to continue to gather and archive and make available teachings about this. So it's just the beginning. My hope is this thing grows, from now until I don't know when, long past me, that as we continue to find things, translate things, create things about this robe sewing practice, that we have a place to put them and make them available to people, right? It's not just for us. So it's a bit of a shift in our focus from this is a practice we kind of did, and everyone kind of does it for themselves, to I think we're responsible to a larger practice community. Okay, so if you don't wear a robe, a rakusu, an okesa, if you've never seen one of these things, this point of our practice is no less meaningful for you. This is much, much bigger from this point of view. Much, much bigger than actually, needle and thread and sewing robes. So before we talk about kesa and dharma R1, we need to step back a little bit and take a broader view of Nyoho that goes beyond just this robe. So a bit what I'm doing today is previewing Sunday's talk, where I'm going to talk about Nyoho in its broadest form. So in North America, I think most of us are first introduced to or first encounter this term Nyoho when we decide to take lay precepts and we sew one of these things. But there's so much more going on. It's a much bigger field than that. So Sunday I'll talk in more depth about Nyoho. But just to sort of put the container around this. So Nyoho. Nyo means in accordance with, and Ho means dharma. Interestingly, the kanji for Nyo can also be pronounced gotoshi in just everyday sort of speech, and this means like or in accordance with. It can also mean the same as, and here we right away, kesa and dharma are one, right? So we've really right off the bat got this thing that says dharma and things are one thing, right? We can't actually pull them apart. So we can read Nyoho as the same as dharma. Not only made in accordance with, made along guidelines and following rules, but the same as, which is we need to hold both of those perspectives when we're talking about all of these things. So that really sets the stage, right, for Ehou ichinyo. So the central question of Nyoho, does this thing, whatever it is, create attachment, create clinging, therefore create suffering? That is the central question of Nyoho. It doesn't matter if you're talking about robes, food, temple, poetry, right? Does this thing create attachment or clinging? Because as we know, grasping, clinging is the root of suffering. It's the root cause of suffering. So we can see that by embracing Nyoho as a practice or as an approach, it really gets to the heart of this practice that we're doing, because sometimes we associate it with exotic looking robes, or maybe not everybody wears a robe. It looks kind of formal. This whole Nyoho thing can feel like something extra. Yeah, we're practicing along, and then, here comes Karnegis, and she's going to put something over the top of this called Nyoho. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. So when I really started to think again, investigate again, Yoho, as it relates to Sanshin style, as it relates to the practice vision, it just became so clear to me. These things are so completely interpenetrated. This is not something extra. This is the basement. This is the ground. This is the context for a lot of what we do here. So, it said there are 3 faces of Nyoho: food, clothing, and shelter. So these are practical, everyday things, practical, everyday human needs. So these serve as huge dharma gates for us, right? Everybody wears clothing. Everybody eats food. Everybody lives, works, exists in some kind of structure, some kind of building, right? So Nyoho is a practice of seeing that all of those things are the same as dharma. So today we're looking at robe, the same as dharma, but all of those things, food, clothing, and shelter, are the same as dharma. They're the same as universal functioning in what Buddha was teaching. So this thing about Ehou, ichinyo, dharma, and nyohoe are one. This comes from 2 fascicles, mainly of the Shobogenzo. So we have the kesa kudoku and we have denne. People who sew these things are probably familiar with those 2 fascicles. It's helpful to just know what are the source texts for this particular kind of teaching. So we have transmission of the robe and we have merit of the robe, 2 of Dogen's fascicles. So Dogen makes the point in both of those fascicles that Buddha's robe and Buddha's teaching are one. They are not separate. We can't pull them apart. So historically, there was renewed interest in those kinds of teachings in the late Tokugawa, which was 17th to mid-19th century. Some folks started to study not only the Shobogenzo, but to go back to the Vinaya, to go back to the original, very early regulations that talk about how we should make these robes, how we should wear these robes. So now, it's not only, they're going back not only to the Shobogenzo, but all the way back to Buddha's time. So we can see the through line, right? We mentioned that a lot here. There's a very direct through line. All the way from Shakyamuni through Dogen, through our 20th century ancestors to what we're doing here. So all of that sets the stage for Sawaki Roshi and his 20th century Nyohoe movement. So while those teachings are much bigger than Sanshin, you can see why we have this particular interest in them, right? Because our own ancestor was a major figure in that. So in my experience, many people in the West are unaware that Kodo Sawaki was one of the major players in this whole Nyoho thing, teaching and encouraging practitioners in Japan to sew these robes by hand and to do them in a particular way, with a particular approach. He was itinerant, right? He was traveling around quite a bit. We don't call him homeless Kodo for nothing. He didn't settle down in one place. So he was sort of outside of the Soto Shu training system in that way. So his work to encourage this practice was done a little bit outside the system, whereas Eko Hashimoto was doing that work inside the system. He was working with novices in training temples, right? So we have these 2 forces happening in a complementary way. So, Sawaki Roshi says, now then, what is the relationship between the kesa and our own school's doctrinal principles? It is simply that the kesa and the Buddha Dharma are one thusness, right? So he's echoing this, kesa and dharma are one. And he goes on to quote this verse, the merit of the kesa is immense. All Buddhas of the 3 times use the kesa as armor to protect themselves from delusion. All sages in the 10 directions use it as a raft to cross the ocean of life and death. So this is like really basic to our practice, crossing the ocean of life and death, right? So according to this, the kesa is the same as practice. It's the same as awakening. It's how we liberate ourselves from delusion and birth and death and samsara and all of that stuff, right? Because he says wearing the kesa is itself the completion of the most important matter and the arrival at the ultimate place. So we're not putting this on in order to, right? Simply putting this on, there we are. We're right in the place we need to be. Awakening is right there. So when we do the robe chant, we say that this robe is a formless field of merit. Right? We do the robe chant in the morning. One of the lines is that this is a formless field of merit. So yes, there is a physical object. There is a physical piece of cloth. Something else is also going on there. One of the elements of Nyoho in general, or things made according to Dharma, according to thusness in general, is that each thing is an individual thing. This is an individual thing. This is an individual thing. And also, it's one thing. So there's a cup, but it's the only cup. There's a raksu, but it's the only raksu. It is the thing. It's another way of saying that robe is a complete manifestation of practice or awakening or dharma, right? So there's a raksu, and yet this is the raksu. There is nothing outside of this raksu. So the same for robes, for food, clothing, shelter, or anything else that we encounter. So what this raksu covers everything. right? Your kesa covers everything, not separate from the Buddha way. So in the Kesa Kodoku, Dogen talks about the robe being handed down from Buddha to Buddha. Now we know that one of the main themes of Dogen's teachings is authentic transmission, unbroken authentic transmission. So here it shows up again. Now we have this connection. One of the things we keep finding out as we look at our practice vision is how all the elements are interpenetrated. So here we go again. We've got Dogen themes and we've got the robe. And they are not separate. So Dogen talks about this robe being handed down from Buddha to Buddha to Buddha. It is said that Shakyamuni, who was 6 feet tall, transmitted the robe to Maitreya, who was 1,000 feet tall, but the kesa was neither too long nor too short. So how does that happen? How do we have a hand-me-down from some guy who's 6 feet tall to some other being who's 1,000 feet tall, and yet it still fits? Now, I don't know if you've encountered this in your own practice, but sometimes we Westerners inherit okesa from our very tiny Japanese teachers. And you just think that's lovely, but it'll never fit. Well, in this case, robe is formless, so robe fits everybody. So when we first receive a robe in a precept ceremony, whether that's the lei raksu, that's an okesa, we put it on our heads, right? And we do a robe chant with everybody. So the whole room is doing the robe chant, even though only a few people are receiving this thing. We do the robe chant, we put on whatever it is. The next day, we come to the temple, we come to the zendo, we're getting ready to practice. What do? We put it on our heads again, we do the robe chant again, we're receiving it again. So every time we put this on, we are receiving it again. If we're just simply going through the motions, we're missing something, right? It's part of this whole dharma and robe are one thing. So every time we put this, every morning, we put this on, we receive it again. So that precept ceremony keeps happening, right? That recommitment happens, but also the receiving of something from the Buddha way, happens every single time. So it's being handed down every morning, which I think is a really nice image. We come to the zendo every morning and we receive the dharma and we receive the robe again. So this is the robe as Buddha's teaching itself. Right? We come, we sit down, we receive some dharma. So this is a robe that doesn't have any fixed size. This is a robe that fits everybody. So both Menzan Zuiho and Sawaki Roshi say, not only the robe as a whole, but each stitch of the robe is a complete manifestation of the dharma. So now we know why when we're sewing these things, I take refuge in Buddha, I take refuge in Buddha, right? Because not only the entire thing, but each stitch we put in it is a complete manifestation of the dharma. So in early Buddhism, of course, the robes were made from rags rather than new material. Patch robe monks, right, were making their things out of cast-offs rather than new material. So you would find your rags in the street or from corpses or some kind of cast-off material. You would cut out the good part and separate that from the parts that were stained or damaged or chewed by mice or whatever, whatever parts you couldn't use. Sew those things together. So today we cut up new material into pieces, so this fabric becomes useless for anything else. It now has no monetary value. So the fabric that made this in a big piece might have been useful for something. When we cut it up into all of those tiny pieces and we sew it back together, and you would think, why would we do that? Because it was perfectly good. That's why we do it. Because this fabric now no longer has any monetary value. It's not useful for anything else. So Sawaki Roshi says this is also a practice of cutting off delusion and cutting off attachment. So just like when we do head shaving, for instance, right? When we're making robes and we're cutting things to size, that's not only about making that robe, there's a practice there of cutting off our attachment to this fabric or to the robe itself or to anything else. So if you can't cut off delusion, even though you're sewing Buddha's robe, which seems to be a wonderful holy act, somehow there's still something not right. There's something out of whack, right? We still have delusion and attachment even though we're sewing Buddha's robe. So we have an opportunity there. I think it's just like the rest of our lives. If we're moving through the world with greed, anger, and ignorance, then no matter what wonderful Buddhist activity we're taking on, we've still gone off the rails, right? There's still something amiss. There's still something kind of awry, you know? Whether or not we're doing zazen work study ritual, if we're doing that full of attachment and greed and anger and ignorance, there's some opportunity that we've missed. There's a hole, there's a gap someplace. So Sawaki Roshi says, only when likes and dislikes are abandoned and hating and loving have been discarded, does Nyohoe, the robe of the Dharma of thusness, manifest itself before us. So when we're coming at this without delusion, greed, anger, ignorance, all that stuff, now this is Buddha's robe. So all this makes the robe a lot more than just sort of a membership badge in a sangha or a symbol of our commitment to practice. Now this robe is a direct manifestation of the Dharma. So sometimes people come here or want to come here. They've taken precepts somewhere else. This happens on a fairly regular basis. They've taken precepts, they've made a raksu, they've received the raksu, and when they come here and they want to start practicing here, for whatever reason they've left their former sangha, they think the first thing they have to do is sew a new raksu. And they'll start talking about, well, now when do you sew raksu? And I'm going, you're wearing a raksu, look, what are you doing? Complete misunderstanding. Somehow they thought this was about membership in the former sangha. I said, you've taken precepts. I recognize you've taken precepts. Good enough for me. Right? So we have to be careful about what we think this is. This is not, I'm a member of the in-crowd. And it's more than a public commitment to practice, although it is that, right? There's something else happening here. It's a direct manifestation of the Dharma. So people, in my experience, have all kinds of sentimental attachments to these things, like, I sweated blood over this, I finally got it done. Right? If you've ever sewed these or taught someone to sew them. Or, well, my teacher wrote on my raksu, or my teacher wore this raksu, or, well, that ceremony was really special, and now I feel like I'm special too, because I did this. Right? We've got all these ideas. We create a lot of self-image out of all of this stuff. Those are understandable human responses. This is what we do as karmic human beings. But of course, not the whole story, right? So taking on living by precepts, taking on wearing this robe, I think, is complete immersion in the Dharma, because again, the robe and the Dharma, not two things. So what better way, what more intensive way to dive into the Dharma with both feet than to stand up and make a public commitment to live this way, and then to vow to wear this, and to fully, wholeheartedly, sincerely wear it for what it is, right? Something interesting is happening there. When we put this thing on, as we've said, that in itself is arriving at awakening. So if we're wearing a robe, and we're still looking for the Buddha, or looking for the Dharma somewhere else, we've gone off the rails, because here it is, right? We're actually wearing the Dharma right on our bodies. We are covered in Dharma, especially if you're wearing a kesa. You are covered in Dharma, which of course is true at any time, right? I mean, we're always covered in Dharma. So I keep wanting to come back to the point that even if you don't have one of these, you're not outside of this Buddha way, right? You're covered in Dharma regardless. And yet, this is a particular kind of Dharma gate, right? It's a particular kind of practice. But you're still engaging in this practice if you're here in the morning and you're chanting the robe chant with everyone else, whether you're doing that in person or virtually. You're chanting away. You don't have a robe of your own to put on. It does not matter. You are wearing Buddha's robe anyway, right? You're not left out of this practice, this universal functioning. So some of us have a robe that looks like a physical object, and some of us are wearing formalist dharma. But nobody gets left out, right? So Uchiyama was a 20th century scholar of this Nyohoe tradition. He wrote a famous book called Kesa no Kenkyu, Studying the Kesa, which came out in 1967. So this is not Vinaya, right? This is 20th century. So he says, if we take up wearing the kesa, yet feel that there is something lacking or that there is something else to seek, then that is nothing more than the desperation of the secular self. I think that's a great phrase. When one puts on the kesa and sits in zazen, the dharma of the Buddha ancestors, pardon me, is complete. Without question, wearing the kesa is the Buddha eye turning on itself. In this way, when one puts on the kesa, one's own self is wrapped in the Buddha Dharma. Without measure, all things are painted in the color of the Buddha Dharma. They have always been wearing the kesa. What a great ending point. Right? Okay, that's enough for me.